In the immortal words of de Gaulle, the USSR is a big country inhabited by many Soviets. He did not actually say this, but due to the size of this nation and the dispersion of its peoples, numerous climates, many of which would be considered by some as impossibly difficult to navigate, had to be made industrious and productive. In many cases, this meant that when accidents of particular importance occurred, there was seldom a convenient resolution. That was, of course, until the pipeline troops. The Soviet army was one of the largest in the world. It is difficult to imagine the scale of mechanization present within this force, alongside its vast array of supporting air assets. The Soviet war machine, an encyclopedia of Russian military equipment and strategy, while not known for its extreme technical accuracy and its desire to, like many other works at the time, reference the USSR as the Russians, provides insight into the hyperbolic perception this numerical superiority garnered in the West. With their planned overkill, the Russians could destroy the whole of human life, probably 10 or 20 times over. One issue with this planned overkill that frequently reared its ugly head to foil good intentions was the fact that this already very large army belonged to the largest country in the world. The USSR's unique topography could easily swallow up even the most impressive militaries, and this applied to their own just as it would any foreign adversary. The logistical burden of defending this indefensibly enormous country from each and every axis was impossibly difficult. It required reliably creating reserves of fuel as well as lubricants for troops stationed in the furthest reaches of the Soviet Union, so that they could drill around the clock, while still having ample supplies in case of hostilities. Delays caused by climatic conditions, such as inclement weather, could under no circumstance transpire, as these resources were required to make the Far East and Far North hospitable. In the 1950s, work began to develop these regions for both military and civilian applications. These efforts were plagued by non-existent communications infrastructure and a lack of roads to accommodate the motorized delivery of goods. This made convoys especially expensive, leading to new options being considered. It was the newly formed pipeline troops that resolved the fuel supply concerns within these remote districts. The first recorded application of fueled pipelines in pursuit of these aims was the erection of a PMT-100 in the direction of the Kamchatka Peninsula. At this time, a Rifle Corps, an Aviation Corps, and an Aviation Technical Division, which included a fuel transport company operating 300 tanks, were stationed there. 30 kilometers from this site, an airfield was located, which relied on a massive reserve of fuel tank trucks operating year-round to move fuel from district depots to divisional and airfield supply points. Inclement weather, beginning in October and ending in May, made this route especially treacherous. The access route to reach Avacha Bay was already steep in normal conditions, but with the addition of harsh Siberian weather, it became nigh impossible to navigate. It was not uncommon for vehicles to become stuck at the fuel delivery point for multiple days, as the incline was too harsh to climb with the presence of heavy snowfall. The road had to be cleared manually, as mechanized means of doing so could not service the terrain. Tunnels had to be dug into 4-meter snowdrifts, after which blizzards would arrive, erasing their efforts. It was decided by the main fuel directorate of the Ministry of Defense and the Fuel Service of the Far Eastern Military District in 1956 that this was indeed unacceptable, and a PMT-100 had to be deployed to solve these issues. It was to be 30 kilometers long and stretched from Sedaglazka to an airfield in Yelizava. 2 permanent fuel depots would be established along this route. Laying this pipeline was a Herculean effort due to the aforementioned reasons. The equipment to embark on this task was delivered by sea from Vladivostok. Berths were employed as unloading points, supported by cranes, and in some cases winches, which offloaded supplies onto non-self-propelled barges towed by tugboats. An incident occurred during this process where a bundle of pipes fell overboard and had to be rescued by divers. Pipes from the first production batch of PMT-100s were employed in this operation, which, unlike later iterations, lacked anti-corrosion coating on their interior walls, which were lined with grease that had to be manually removed before laying could be engaged. To begin moving fuel through these lines, pumping stations, manufactured by Chrysler, supplied during the war, were provided alongside VPS-51 gasoline pumping stations mounted on GAZ-51s. These were called PSG-65-130s. Once all of the relevant equipment had been delivered, a pipeline company consisting of 2 platoons was organized. This company was subordinate to a fuel depot located in Sedaglazka. With the introduction of this pipeline, the supply of fuel to Kamchatka improved markedly. Accounting for delivered fuel was also streamlined and became more accurate, which reduced consumption. It was also possible to increase the amount of fuel delivered, as prior to the PMT-100's installation, Residual fuel from 50 to 300 liters would remain in the tanks of the trucks to facilitate an uninterrupted return. As a result, the airfield began to form reserves, sometimes reaching hundreds of tons of surplus fuel. Though this line was not without its complications. As this was the 1950s, modern protective suits for patrol and emergency teams had not yet been designed. As a result, servicing this pipeline in winter conditions was especially dangerous. Soldiers had to strip down to their underwear to avoid soaking their uniforms in fuel while repairing the malfunction, after which they were wrapped in sheepskin coats and taken to a bathhouse to warm themselves. This was eventually resolved as time went on. This operation was engaged in the same year the PMT-100 entered service, which proved that field pipelines were indeed an extremely effective solution to easing supply concerns in remote areas. Major General A.T. Golubyev, commander of the Rifle Corps on the peninsula, became a strong proponent of the pipeline troops following this endeavor. Interestingly, the elevated status of the 7th Pipeline Brigade within the group of Soviet forces in Germany can in part be attributed to this event, as he would go on to become the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the GSFG for logistics. It was this experience and the continued operation of similar installations in remote areas that allowed the pipeline troops to partake in the construction of the BAM. Hundreds of cases of the pipeline troops assisting military units in remote regions would be noted. Naming all of them would be redundant and increase the length of the video substantially. Some of them are mentioned in part 1 of this series, but as this video focuses on civil affairs, I believed it was reasonable to discuss the first case of this happening, and move on to how this gained them a rather interesting position within the Ministry of Defense, as the only unit that could be called upon to solve these problems. In the fall of 1974, it was becoming increasingly difficult to transport fuel to those constructing the railway, as it stretched deeper into the underdeveloped regions of the USSR. The Council of Ministers of the USSR called upon the pipeline troops to resolve this, as they were at this point well known for easing logistical burdens in territory that lacked road or rail transport. 3 separate pipeline battalions were assigned to the task, which would become subordinate to the Ministry of Railways. The first of these battalions to arrive in the area of operation was the 1462nd Pipeline Battalion. The unit immediately got to work installing a pipeline from the Lena River to the primary construction site. I am aware that I have begun to sound like a broken record throughout this series, but I will once again note that the extreme conditions present in this region significantly complicated the deployment process. Though it must be said that in this case, these conditions were remarkable even by previously established standards. The presence of numerous swamps, permafrost, and floods was especially problematic. In 1975, the transfer of pipeline personnel from the Transbaikal and Far Eastern military districts to the area of operation was completed. 3 sets of PMT-100s were delivered alongside them. Fuel depots were deployed in Railway Brigade material support facilities as it was delivered. Large reserves of fuel were never established due to the fear of creating a disastrous wildfire if an incident occurred. Due to this concern, fuel was delivered in limited incremental fashion along 2 lines stretching to nearby transshipment zones. These routes averaged 25 kilometers in length. Due to the unstable, muddy terrain, which often absorbed entire pipeline sections as winter turned to summer, vehicles could not be used for transporting sections. Helicopters had to be used to ferry them from storage points. Pumping stations had to be installed on log foundations, and in some cases, entire pipeline sections received similar treatment. I cannot stress how incredibly burdensome this was, having to build what were effectively flotation devices for this equipment so that they could be placed on the ground without being absorbed by the earth. In some cases, even these preventative measures would be decisively routed by the mud. Patrol and emergency teams had to forego their standard transport vectors and switch to skis and snowmobiles for much of the year, even when there was no snow on the ground for this reason. The pipeline troops could not be deterred by the unforgiving climate they found themselves in, as the railway troops were in dire need of their services. The nearly 1,000 kilometers of pipeline deployed in support of the BAM construction effort allowed for this operation to stretch to previously inaccessible areas. The strict schedule and importance of their work offered valuable lessons to the leadership within the pipeline troops that would later be employed and expanded upon in Afghanistan. I am embarking on this tangent because I neglected to mention this feature in earlier videos, and I believe that it is important. I couldn't exactly find a way to fit it in, so I'm going to speak about it here. Like NATO, the Warsaw Pact also had its own stationary pipeline network stretching across Allied territory, which supplied fuel to the western and southwestern theaters of operation. This entire network by the early 1980s was capable of delivering a combined 25,000 tons of fuel per day. This pipeline network was established to ease the burden that strategic fuel delivery would have placed on railways. It was expanded until 1989, when it was deemed to have finally been completed. The construction of this pipeline in Czechoslovakia began after agreements were reached on April 20th, 1972. It was improved to service Hungary on April 26, 1985. Studies were conducted in 1989 to improve this pipeline in cooperation with Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but these never materialized as a result of the collapse. Due to the capabilities of field pipelines, it was long understood within the main fuel directorate that the advantages presented by this equipment could prove especially useful in emergency situations. This was a general term to describe industrial accidents, ecological disasters, sabotage, both military and civilian in nature, and any other event that would warrant the mobilization of an especially large contingent of personnel. Throughout much of the pipeline troops' existence, their theoretical practicality in eliminating consequences of the aforementioned circumstances was proven time and time again. The first well-documented event of this nature in which the pipeline troops played a pivotal role was in the summer of 1967, when a fire broke out in Lyashevka, which quickly spread throughout the settlement. When local firefighters arrived, they were met with 27 houses consumed by the inferno. They did not have enough fire engines or manpower to reliably deliver enough water from the neighboring lake to all of the structures. This complication rapidly escalated in its importance until a training company on standby at the Ulanovsk Military Technical School was mobilized. With great haste, they got to work laying a pipeline to deliver water to those battling the fire. The unit had to accomplish the task with what little resources they brought to bear. For this reason, PSG 65-130 fuel pumping stations were repurposed to move water through this pipeline. Without the efforts of this improvised formation, there would not have been enough water to protect homes that had yet to be consumed by the fire, let alone extinguish it. Following the successful implementation of the pipeline troops to quell this fire, from 1968 to 1969, this experience was expanded upon by the 71st Separate Pipeline Battalion and 1st Pipeline Battalion, who were tasked with combating widespread peat fires. It was here that the true potential of the pipeline troops to assist in firefighting was realized. These battalions would momentarily relocate to areas in which such fires were present, and, at the request of local leadership, form teams to deploy PM-200s in an effort to extinguish them. While we do know these operations were successful, according to secondary sources, no official reports have been released on the matter. All of the aforementioned experience culminated in 1972. At this time, massive forest fires began to rage across the country. An especially dry summer, the absence of rain, and unusually high air temperatures created the perfect conditions for a disaster. In some regions, entire towns had to be evacuated, as they were projected to be in the fire's path. Strategic rocket force installations, heavy industry, and large settlements were all at risk of destruction. The Ministry of Defense and Civil Defense were mobilized to fight the fires, but due to how remote these locations were, water sources were not readily available. Some of these fires were corralled through the use of bulldozers and associated engineering equipment, but this was not enough. Due to the drought caused by the unusually hot summer, water could not be collected from local streams. As a result, it was concluded that pipeline brigades were the only solution. Within less than a day, battalions were arriving in the area and began to deploy field pipelines with the intention of transporting water to those battling the fires. As smoke wafted to the capital on August 10, 1972, the Moscow Military District mobilized the 83rd Separate Pipeline Battalion from the 95th Pipeline Brigade to partake in these efforts. The unit marched 160 kilometers and on the morning of the following day had arrived in the area, and in conjunction with local authorities, began to plan their deployment. Nikitin allocated officers, warrant officers, and cadets from the 184th Military School, alongside a motor transport element to bring the 95th Brigade to wartime strength from August 11th to 12th. The 1st Deputy Chief of the Rear Services joined the formation as they marched with the intention of assisting in easing the burden of coordinating the unit. Following a clumsy emergency activation, the 95th Pipeline Brigade dispersed platoons at each available source of fresh water, where PSG-160, PSG-65-130s, and PNU 100-200Ms were deployed. An additional 50 pump stations had to be provided to the formation to facilitate this. In the Kiev Military District, the 45th Pipeline Brigade and the 5th Separate Pipeline Battalion faced similar complications. While the unit's command staff departed with great efficiency, arriving at the mobilization point by helicopter within 2 hours, it took at least 1 day for the 1st Pipeline Battalion to depart by rail. Pump stations were placed unusually close to the waterline to better harness the PNU 100-200M's capabilities. This, in some regards, improved the rate at which water could be pushed through the pipeline. When pumping through shorter sections closer to the fire, it was common for multiple stations to operate together to facilitate the required throughput. The size of these fires, alongside their dispersion, created uniquely difficult conditions that required the pipeline troops to develop an entirely new approach to how they operated. The need to communicate with other branches of the armed forces was not a problem, but needing to exchange info with local authorities and civil defense was. Constant around-the-clock reconnaissance was especially important, as the situation was constantly changing, and the pipeline troops had to be prepared to combat fires as they spread. Aerial reconnaissance, which was a new concept within the pipeline troops, was employed at scale for the first time due to the enormous area of operation. As the brigade had to be prepared to deploy new lines at the drop of a hat, a strong reserve was created at the unit's command post, possessing 15 kilometers of laying capability, a transport contingent, and a repair shop. This reserve proved useful between August 22nd to 24th, as the fire began to advance to Radovetsk-Kimok. The additional assets presented at the command center took the place of one of the brigade's operational companies, which began to deploy water supply lines to those stationed at the town, who managed to keep the fire at bay. Without this reserve, it is likely that the settlement would have caught fire, as there would have been no available assets to ensure the uninterrupted supply of water to other sectors. This would have been especially problematic as this settlement housed a large logging company and oil refinery. The experience gained from this event cannot be overstated. The expedient drilling of personnel on safety standards they were unfamiliar with was mastered, and the assignment of observers, as they were known, to formations was engaged. These individuals monitored heat conditions, carbon dioxide levels, the operability of protective equipment, briefed personnel on evacuation routes, and ensured that units were replaced in a timely fashion to prevent overexposure. It is obvious how these skills became important later down the line, following the introduction of the pipeline troops to the liquidation efforts in Chernobyl. After the fires had been extinguished, reports were drafted on the efficacy of each formation. The timeline of events, as noted in this report, is as follows. Until August 28th, the 95th Pipeline Brigade was primarily focused on deploying new pipeline sections. From August 23rd to 28th, all of these deployed sections were in use and were actively engaged in the supply of 87.8 thousand tons of water per day. By August 29th, the fires had largely been extinguished. At this point, the brigade shifted to decommissioning sections that were no longer in use. This is reflected in the report drafted on the performance of the 131st Pipeline Brigade, and so I won't repeat exactly what I said, as they engaged pretty much the same actions. For both brigades, the average delivery rate was around 50,000 tons of water per day. It goes without saying that delivering anywhere near this amount by road would be impossible, especially when one considers that the only equipment available to engage such a task was ARS-12Ds requisitioned from the chemical troops, which were used for spraying fires. The average length of sections deployed throughout the course of this event was 1 to 8 kilometers in length, which encompassed 77.5% of the lines deployed by the 95th Brigade and 62% deployed by the 131st. Over the course of the operation, 4,593 million cubic meters of water were provided by the pipeline troops, which were employed across 44,000 hectares. Nikitin analyzed this data at Narofominsk in November of that year. The actions of the 95th and 131st Brigades were used to develop a comprehensive doctrine for future firefighting endeavors within the pipeline troops. It must be noted that this was by no means a safe task for these formations. In many cases, pump stations were surrounded by fire and the operators had to be evacuated. In one instance, after recovering all necessary equipment, a pumping unit attempted to escape from the rapidly closing wildfire. On the way out, they had to pass a section of road that was actively engulfed in flames. This resulted in the loss of 2 vehicles and 2 pump stations, but the survival of all of the operators. The extremely successful application of field pipelines to combat the 1972 fires was noted by other branches of the Soviet military. In 1973, civil defense leadership met with elements of the pipeline troops and received demonstrations of their equipment. Consequently, in 1975, the PTGO 100 and 150-6-4 field pipeline was adopted for civil defense application, and a pipeline platoon was introduced into each regiment within the organization. These platoons could deploy 10 kilometers of pipeline, split between PMT 150, which encompassed 4 kilometers, and PMT 100, which encompassed 6. In December of 1975, within the Bashkir ASSR, one of the largest sugar factories operating in the Soviet Union was slowly being decommissioned. The factory produced 360 tons of sugar each day, and seeing as it was in its twilight years, standards began to lose their significance. Notably, the pits in which waste from the factory was to be disposed of were not constructed as thoroughly as they had been in prior years, meaning that waste, namely beet sludge from the beet sugar that was being produced, began to fill and saturate these wells, which actually proved to be a net positive, as this waste was determined by scientists who inspected the site to be a highly efficient fertilizer, and so pumping it from these ill-prepared wells was of great importance. The Volga military district was contacted and informed of the exceedingly unique predicament that the factory had found themselves in, which resulted in members of their pipeline battalion being requisitioned. The unit brought students from the Ufa Petroleum Institute to provide hands-on lessons in a situation that was not especially dire. A single pump station was employed in this operation, which was mounted on a tractor. These wells were drained for over a month until it was decided that pumping was no longer needed and the battalion could return home. You cannot make this stuff up. In 1976, a hot and dry summer brought a particularly severe drought to the city of Zlatoust. Rivers and reservoirs dried up, leaving many factories in the area without a steady supply of water. Nearby, a pipeline brigade was preparing for a 600-kilometer deployment exercise. Local leadership contacted the brigade and requested that 1 battalion be provided to the city to ease the concerns their factories were facing. After preparing all necessary equipment, the battalion arrived as quickly as it could. After reaching the expected deployment route, they were met with a unique issue. There was not a single sufficient water source within reasonable proximity. The unit decided that the only way it could supply its PSG-160 pumping stations with enough water to operate effectively was to construct multiple small dams to reroute streams that had not yet been reduced by the heat in the mountains. The formation had to cope with the unbearably difficult conditions, especially the altitude, to deploy the 7 12-kilometer lines required by the city, forcing them to march sometimes 200 meters, carrying PMT-150s, which are not light, in the heat. Pressure regulators had to be installed to account for the severe shifts in elevation encountered on the route. These pipelines operated for 3 months, with personnel from the brigade rotating in 3 shifts. The career officers and warrant officers present since the arrival of the battalion were not afforded such a convenience. In 1981, yet another series of wildfires erupted around Moscow, this time only requiring the application of 1 company from the 95th Brigade. A 12-kilometer pipeline was deployed from the Borovaya River to the Mozhaisk Forest, which was used to flood burning peat bogs. Mirroring the events of 1972, August brought hot, dry weather, which led to fires spreading more substantially than initially expected. The 95th Pipeline Brigade was mobilized in just a day, and within 2 began to deploy 23 lines from various water sources to hotspots. 1 million tons of water were provided throughout this operation, and 140 hectares were saved from what could have been another disaster. In both 1981 and 1972, military leadership unfamiliar with the capabilities of the pipeline troops often demanded rather foolish actions, notably the laying of pipelines to each individual tree. In 1980, phenol, originating from the Chimprom Production Association, entered the water supply of Ufa. The city required a minimum of 3,000 cubic meters of drinking water each day, with the only reserve being 20 kilometers away. The pipeline troops were mobilized to deliver fresh water to those reliant on the contaminated supply, and in less than 1 day the city was connected to the reserve, and the cleanup could begin. In 1984, Sevastopol's water supply was interrupted. To satisfy the city's needs, a pipeline company was mobilized from the Black Sea Fleet, which proceeded to deploy 2 25-kilometer PMT-150 lines, delivering 4,000 cubic meters per day. That same year, the pipeline troops were used to deliver drinking water to the Alazani Valley in the Armenian SSR, which was suffering a severe drought. This water also saw use by farmers in the area. In February, the pipeline troops would once again be called upon to resolve accidents within the civilian sector. A petroleum pipeline supplying fuel to Ulanovsk had burst, which was caused by an unusually harsh winter, forcing frost deeper than anticipated by previously established regulations. This led to cracks forming, rendering 15 kilometers of the pipeline inoperable. The pipeline administration of the USSR requested that cadets be mobilized from the Ulanovsk Higher Military Technical School to assist, 25 of whom were sent. The students and their professor departed for the site with a set of PMT-150s with the intention of bypassing the damaged section and restoring fuel to the city. The team had to contend with temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius and especially deep snow. Despite the unfavorable conditions, the pipeline was installed within 5 days. The permanent pipeline was welded to PMT-P150s and remained in use for 3 months until the line could be serviced. One of the most important actions engaged by the pipeline troops throughout their existence was marked by their participation in the liquidation efforts in Chernobyl. This effort deserves a video of its own, as it was a truly Herculean task, but covering the pipeline troops' activity in the region can be summarized in this section. The tragedy of Chernobyl was resolved with remarkable haste after the nation mobilized to contain its consequences. Part of this expedient resolve can be attributed to the pipeline troops. The radioactive dust kicked up by motorized transportation was especially problematic, as thousands of vehicles were required to move in and out of the area on a daily basis. While the port of Pripyat did prove useful, delivering 6,000 tons of material to build the sarcophagus, This number paled in comparison to the 300,000 tons required throughout the entire project, much of which arrived by road. Water became a precious resource around the NPP as it was required to operate the nearby concrete plant and decontamination. This amounted to a daily consumption rate between 3.5 to 4,000 cubic meters. This water had to be clean and therefore could not come from the various rivers in the 30-kilometer zone surrounding the NPP. It was concluded that to supply this much fresh water, 250 trucks would be required, which would make the liquidation efforts more costly as they too would need to be decontaminated, and pose the risk of raising clouds of radioactive dust that accumulated along their route. It was concluded that the pipeline troops would be required to ease this burden. By the end of April, 3 separate pipeline companies were mobilized to engage in this task. The 384th Company of the Kiev Military District, the 374th Company of the Belarusian Military District, and the 375th Company of the Carpathian Military District. Due to how important these units were to the operation, they did not have ample time to provide training to the personnel manning these formations, and as a result, much of the explanation transpired on site. By early June, the 1,254th Separate Pipeline Battalion received an order to form the 374th Separate Pipeline Company by mobilizing 75 members of their staff, and their relevant equipment, which was to be sent to Chernobyl immediately. This unit was allotted 2 days to coordinate, take the military oath, train those who would operate 3 PSG-160 pump stations they arrived with, and begin preparing its heavy equipment. It was at this time that the company was provided with special protective equipment. Communications equipment, dosimeters, 3-day field rations, field kitchens, and tents were supplied by the district. Polyethylene was also provided so that the tents could be sealed and soldiers would not make contact with potentially contaminated soil. Pipes and equipment necessary to deploy them were delivered by rail. On June 14th, as early as possible, the units set out in a column comprised of 22 vehicles, on the way to their destination, which was Savichi. They were met by the command staff of the Belarusian 4th Sector, who accompanied them to this location. Once the unit reached its deployment zone, the sector chief of logistics briefed the company on their enemy, which in this case was invisible, odorless, and could follow them into even the most clever of hiding places. Together with the formation, the level of radiation was assessed, after which it was determined that a large clearing in the nearby pine forest was the ideal position for setting up camp. 1 kilometer from this camp, a civil defense regiment was stationed, which maintained constant contact with the company about the radiation situation. Mirroring the unfamiliarity that was noted earlier during the pipeline troops' various firefighting endeavors, the purpose of the company stationed within the sector was not immediately understood by its commanding officers. The unit was assumed to be little more than a water supply company, and as a result suggested the delivery of water to buildings as needed by the Civil Defense Regiment, which was at that time heavily focused on decontamination. It was stated that only temporary pipelines, capable of supplying around 10 cubic meters per day, were needed. It took quite a bit of explaining to eventually convince sector leadership that the company was here to lay high-throughput pipelines to supply a great deal of water, which was then to be disseminated to trucks at specific locations, and that it would be impossible to lay pipelines to each building on a whim. This misunderstanding led to sector leadership having to figure out what to use the pipeline company for, as their capabilities far exceeded what was previously expected. Eventually, after the subject was pondered for a moment, the company commander was retasked to lay a pipeline from Smela to a treatment point operating ARS-12 decontamination vehicles. These vehicles were previously reliant on fire trucks to deliver water to the treatment point, but by now many of them had broken down, meaning the ARS-12s needed to drive 5 kilometers to collect water from a nearby well, which was beginning to run out. On June 16th, 12 pipeline trucks, a crane, and a fuel tanker set out to solve this issue, which required 5 kilometers of PMTP-150 and 2 PNU-100-200 pumping stations. Within 1 day, the unit had finished with the line, which impressed sector leadership so thoroughly that they requested another line be installed to service all vehicles operating in the area, employing tanks of water. This required the existing route to be extended by an additional 5 kilometers, which was finished at a similar pace. This station made the decontamination of surrounding settlements and terrain significantly easier, and freed up numerous motorized vehicles for application elsewhere. Due to the very real fear that peat fires could erupt as they did in Moscow within the exclusion zone, spreading contaminants well outside the 30-kilometer radius, holes were drilled into the aforementioned pipeline. These would release 10 to 15 square meters of water into the surrounding fields, saturating them to such a degree that it would be impossible for spontaneous ignition to occur. The pressurized nature of these pipelines meant this did not actually interrupt the flow of water to all of the points that needed them. Just a few days later, the commander of the 374th Separate Pipeline Company received an order to construct a pipeline which would deliver water to the soon-to-be-arriving equipment decontamination point in Chernihiv. The facilities connected to the previously constructed pipeline had a relatively low demand for water each day, and it was for this reason that the unit decided to extend the existing line, as this would be significantly easier than deploying one from scratch. Within one day of receiving this order, 10 kilometers had been deployed, extending the total length of the route to 35 kilometers. Water began to flow through this pipeline that same day, which provided 40 cubic meters per day to the decontamination point. A fuel bladder storing 5 cubic meters of water was created to provide the unit with a reserve in case the pipeline suffered a malfunction, of which only 5 occurred in its entire service life. The water consumed by the decontamination point was collected in 2 still tanks with a capacity of 25 cubic meters each, which had to be emptied in a way that did not compromise the surrounding area. To reduce the difficulty of this operation, a short 0.3 kilometer pipeline was deployed, which would drain the water into a prepared dumping site. In addition to this pipeline, 2 relatively short lines were deployed to the living quarters of the Civil Defense Regiment to provide clean water for the unit to bathe themselves and wash their equipment less tediously, which was greatly appreciated. These were 1.5 and 3 kilometers respectively. When personnel were not washing themselves, they dedicated the water supplied by these lines to decontaminating their vehicles. The last line deployed by this unit was a 0.6 kilometer extension of the existing line to connect a filling station in Kaparenka. The company assisted the Civil Defense Regiment in preparing for the arrival of a CPSU Central Committee inspection of the liquidation efforts, as the unit hoped to demonstrate the process by which buildings were decontaminated. As the company had already worked tirelessly over the last few days, the commander asked for volunteers to assist the regiment. To his surprise, there was a considerable number of personnel ready to prepare access routes and deploy PSG-160 pump stations. Aided only by the light of the moon and the headlights of their vehicles, the company prepared wooden platforms to prevent the heavy PSG-160s from sinking into the muddy bank of the nearest suitable river. The operation began at 9 p.m. and lasted until 7 a.m. Much of this time was spent lowering the pump stations to their respective platforms using winches, as the bank was unreasonably steep and denied conventional deployment methods. At 8 a.m., as the water tank trucks began to arrive, the company could finally rest. The PSG-160s would be operated for 3 days, after which they would be dismantled and returned to the company's encampment. On September 2nd, the company commander was informed that within 2 days he was to disassemble the 40-kilometer pipeline, alongside all pumping stations deployed along the route, and depart with his equipment to a new location. For all intents and purposes, this order was absurd, and once again demonstrated the lack of understanding present within other branches towards failed pipelines. It would be impossible with just 75 men to accomplish such a demanding task. The company commander approached the leadership of the civil defense regiments, who looked favorably upon the pipeline troops after they had eased their supply burdens. The company was rapidly expanded to encompass 400 men and 30 vehicles, all volunteers from units they had assisted. By September 3rd, with such a significant increase in manpower, the pipeline was completely disassembled well ahead of schedule. Unfortunately, the enthusiastic assistance of the civil defense personnel had unintended consequences, as they were not adequately trained in dismantling field pipelines. As a result, individual sections, couplings, and other assorted equipment were either imperceptibly damaged or loaded improperly. After these issues had been resolved, the company broke into 2 sections, one dedicated to loading pipeline sections and pumping stations onto railcars, and the other marching the unit's motorized implement to their new sector. Radiation reconnaissance was kept to a maximum to ensure the safety of the pipeline troops in the area of operation. When a route was chosen, the radiation levels present were assessed, after which reports were drafted on the possibility of the area in which the pipeline was deployed being contaminated further by release from the reactor, as this continued at varying intensities. Great attention was paid to weather conditions and rainfall, which could lead to certain areas soaking up more radiation than others. This could prove especially dangerous if the pipeline was contaminated beyond a degree that was safe to approach by the pipeline troops. In many cases, the radiation levels where pumping stations were to be installed had to be either delayed, once again decontaminated, or abandoned entirely to ensure the safety of personnel. The pipeline troops were often followed by a contingent to treat the roads they drove on. This was done in 0.5 kilometer sections, which required quite a bit of water. Similar success was experienced by companies located in other sectors. The 384th Company of the Kiev Military District deployed 48 kilometers of pipeline. And while the actions of all three separate pipeline companies operating in the exclusion zone are not entirely understood, it is known that in August of 1986, 114,000 cubic meters of water were supplied by these units. In June of 1986, disposing of contaminated water became especially problematic, as no streamlined solution to address this had been implemented, meaning each sector approached the task differently. The aforementioned companies could not be employed as they were occupied. Diverting their attention would lead to delays in delivering water, which was a vital resource. It was decided that the Leningrad Military District would organize a separate pipeline battalion, which was to arrive within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone by June 30th. The unit completed its 1,500-kilometer railway transit to the area in just 8 days after receiving the mobilization order. Following this, they marched 140 kilometers to the Ivankovsky district, where they would be stationed. Unfortunately, upon arrival, they were immediately informed that their services were no longer required, as the complication had been resolved by the natural reduction in water consumption resulting from continued decontamination efforts. The battalion was ordered to begin training its personnel within the exclusion zone, so that they could be better prepared for their eventual activation sometime in the near future. This order came in early July, when the battalion was instructed to deploy a 20-kilometer pipeline to 2 decontamination points in Stare Sokoly. In August, another order was issued to the battalion requesting the deployment of a 3-kilometer pipeline to Stare Mok, where an encampment was being prepared for the construction troops, who required, and this is the number they gave, 300 cubic meters of water per hour. This number is likely exaggerated unless they were building a pool, as no projects engaged by this unit would have mandated this throughput. Later that month, on August 29th, the battalion was withdrawn from the region and returned to its home district. The individual that commanded this formation was a veteran of the Afghan War who had just returned home. I cannot imagine how insulted he must have felt being mobilized to fulfill his further duties in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, after which he was told that he was no longer needed, should just do push-ups in a field, and then drown a construction troops encampment before being asked to go home. In 1987, in the city of Severomorsk, a water main failed. Under normal circumstances, this would not be especially problematic, but in this case, the water main was integral to supplying the city's power plant. To prevent a situation where the population lost access to heating and other amenities, the Northern Fleet deployed its pipeline company, which resolved the issue. In 1989, the pipeline troops would be called upon to partake in the cleanup of another catastrophic event, that being the earthquake in Armenia. More specifically, the system providing water to Spatak, which had been rendered inoperable. A population desperate for water, pursuing alternative sources in an environment where industrial waste had been spread throughout the disaster site, could have led to severe issues, and therefore the operation was expedited. The 133rd Pipeline Brigade of the Transcaucasian Military District was mobilized and equipped with a PMTP-100, which ensured faster deployment. Initially, the unit planned to establish a 100-kilometer pipeline between Lake Sivan and the city, but the mountain passes in the way complicated the operation. They forced the formation 1,500 meters above sea level into temperatures below negative 20 degrees Celsius. While this could have been done, the very real possibility of water freezing in the pipeline could have jeopardized the entire operation. Surveys were launched to find more convenient sources of fresh water, which located multiple small reservoirs that could be employed. The unit's medical staff was tasked with around-the-clock water quality monitoring to determine if contaminants, such as the pipeline's zinc coating, were leaking into the water. Due to the location of the recently discovered reserves, calculations were conducted to justify the continued use of PMTP-100s. It was found that PMT-150 series pipelines could supply 100,000 people, while a PMT-100 series pipeline could satisfy 35,000. To create a degree of redundancy, it was concluded that 8 PMTP-100 pipelines would be deployed, each with a length of 24 kilometers, feeding into 85 distribution points throughout the city. These distribution points were constructed from materials that the district fuel repair service had on hand. The throughput of these pipelines surpassed 210 cubic meters per hour. I would like to call back to the request of the construction troops, which was 90 cubic meters per hour more than supplying this entire city with water. The final act of the pipeline troops in this field was their participation in cleaning up the accident that occurred at the Azotos chemical plant in Yanova, which released a considerable degree of ammonia. The plant required large quantities of fresh water, but did not possess the motorized transport to meet these demands. The issue was resolved by the pipeline troops. Information about this event is sparing, and therefore I can only confirm that the branch was there and why they were called upon in the first place.